The day started like any other in the bustling city of Eldenford, where cobblestone streets wound through rows of colorful market stalls. Merchants shouted their wares, children darted between carts, and the faint smell of freshly baked bread wafted through the air. But beneath this lively scene lay an undercurrent of tension. Armed officers patrolled the streets, their presence a constant reminder of the delicate balance between order and unrest. Captain Roderick was one such officer. A tall man with graying hair and piercing blue eyes, he carried himself with quiet authority. Years of service had taught him patience, but today felt different. The summer heat seemed heavier than usual, pressing down on everyone's shoulders, and small arguments broke out more frequently among the townsfolk. It was as if the entire city was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Roderick's instincts sharpened when he heard raised voices near the central marketplace. Pushing his way through the crowd, he saw Lady Ilara standing at the center of the commotion. She was impossible to miss. Her emerald green gown shimmered in the sunlight, and her golden hair cascaded over her shoulders like a waterfall. Around her, merchants gestured angrily while a few guards looked unsure of what to do next. Lady Ilara was no stranger to making scenes. Known for her fiery temper and unshakable confidence, she often walked a fine line between charm and arrogance. Today, however, she had crossed it. When asked to pay the standard toll for goods purchased at the market, she laughed dismissively. "A toll? For me?" she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "I serve the king directly. Surely my contributions to the crown outweigh your petty fees." Her words sparked murmurs among the onlookers. Some nodded sympathetically. Others exchanged knowing glances, silently criticizing her sense of entitlement. One merchant, emboldened by frustration, retorted, "Even the king pays his dues. Why should you be exempt?" This only fueled Lady Ilara's defiance. She crossed her arms and declared that she would leave without paying, daring anyone to stop her. That's when Roderick stepped in. His arrival drew immediate attention. People parted to let him through, whispering about how he always managed to appear just when things threatened to spiral out of control. "Lady Ilara," Roderick began, his tone calm but firm. "These rules apply to everyone, regardless of rank or title. If we allow exceptions, chaos will follow." Ilara turned to face him, her green eyes flashing with irritation. "And who are you to lecture me?" she shot back. "You're nothing more than a glorified watchman." The insult hung in the air, but Roderick didn't flinch. Instead, he met her gaze steadily, aware that every eye in the square was now fixed on them. He knew this wasn't just about a toll anymore. It was about fairness, respect, and whether the laws truly meant something in Eldenford. As the crowd waited anxiously for what would happen next, Roderick realized this confrontation might test not only his resolve, but also the fragile peace of the entire city. Lady Ilara's sharp words hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy and charged with tension. The crowd around them buzzed with anticipation, some leaning forward to catch every word while others nervously shuffled their feet, unsure if they wanted to witness what might come next. Captain Roderick, however, didn't falter. He had faced difficult situations before, but there was something about Lady Ilara's defiance that felt particularly challenging. Her confidence bordered on arrogance, and her refusal to acknowledge the rules struck a nerve, not just with him, but with many of the townsfolk watching silently. "You misunderstand my role, Lady Ilara," Roderick replied, his voice steady despite the weight of her insult. "I am not here to lecture you. I'm here to ensure that everyone follows the same laws, regardless of who they are or what title they hold. If we start making exceptions, where does it end?" Ilara raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "Oh, how noble of you," she said mockingly, her tone laced with sarcasm. "Tell me, Captain, do you think your little rules matter more than the work I do for the crown? Do you even understand the sacrifices I've made for this kingdom?" She gestured dramatically to herself, as if her mere presence should be enough to silence all opposition. The crowd murmured again, divided in their opinions. Some nodded along with Ilara, believing her status granted her special privileges. Others frowned, thinking she sounded spoiled and out of touch. One elderly woman muttered loudly enough for those nearby to hear, "Sacrifices? What sacrifices? Last week, she rode her horse right through my fruit stand and didn't even apologize." Roderick ignored the growing chatter and focused on Ilara. "Your service to the crown is commendable," he admitted, choosing his words carefully. "But that doesn't exempt you from the responsibilities we all share. These tolls fund projects that benefit everyone: roads, schools, protection. Without them, the city suffers." Ilara scoffed, waving a hand dismissively. "The city suffers? Please, this is nothing more than a scheme to fill the pockets of greedy merchants. And besides," she added with a smirk, "I doubt the king would approve of harassing someone loyal to him over a few coins." Before Roderick could respond, a new voice cut through the noise. "Lady Ilara." It belonged to one of her attendants, a young man dressed in fine clothing who had been lingering at the edge of the crowd. He hurried forward, whispering urgently into her ear. Whatever he said caused her expression to shift slightly, though she quickly masked it with another haughty glare. Moments later, the sound of clanking armor announced the arrival of two figures clad in gleaming silver plate, members of the king's guard. They moved with precision, parting the crowd as they approached. At their lead was Sir Alden, a broad-shouldered knight whose stern face seemed carved from stone. His crimson cape billowed behind him as he stopped beside Lady Ilara, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. "This ends now," Sir Alden declared, his deep voice carrying authority. He turned to Roderick, his piercing gaze locking onto the captain. "You will step aside immediately. Lady Ilara is under the protection of the crown, and any further interference will be seen as an act of insubordination." The atmosphere shifted instantly. The townsfolk exchanged uneasy glances, sensing that the stakes had just risen dramatically. Roderick stood his ground, though he couldn't deny the tightening in his chest. He knew confronting a member of the king's guard was no small matter, but backing down would send a dangerous message that power and privilege could override justice. For a moment, the square fell eerily silent, save for the distant hum of the marketplace. All eyes were on Roderick, waiting to see how he would respond. Would he yield to the pressure, or would he stand firm against overwhelming odds? As the seconds ticked by, the tension became almost unbearable, like the calm before a storm. Everyone present understood that this confrontation was far from over, and the choices made here would ripple through the city long after the day ended. The arrival of Sir Alden and the king's guards shifted the dynamic entirely. The once chaotic marketplace fell into an uneasy silence, as if the entire city was holding its breath. Sir Alden's towering frame and commanding presence demanded attention, his crimson cape catching the sunlight like a flame. His piercing gaze swept over the crowd before settling firmly on Captain Roderick. There was no mistaking the challenge in his eyes. It was clear he viewed this confrontation as a direct affront to the authority of the crown. "This is not your jurisdiction," Sir Alden said, his voice low but laced with steel. "Lady Ilara is under our protection, and any attempt to detain or harass her will be met with consequences." Roderick didn't flinch. He had faced threats before, both subtle and overt, but something about Sir Alden's tone set him on edge. It wasn't just the words. It was the underlying arrogance, the assumption that rank alone could override fairness. Still, Roderick kept his composure, knowing that losing his temper would only make things worse. "I mean no disrespect to the crown," Roderick replied evenly, his hands resting lightly on the hilt of his sword. "But justice applies to everyone equally, regardless of title or station. If Lady Ilara refuses to pay the toll, it undermines the system we all rely on." Sir Alden's jaw tightened at the response. Clearly, he hadn't expected Roderick to stand his ground so firmly. Behind him, Lady Ilara crossed her arms smugly, clearly enjoying the spectacle she had created. She leaned closer to one of her attendants and whispered something that made them chuckle softly. The sound carried faintly through the tense air, further irritating those already frustrated by her behavior. The townsfolk began to murmur again, their voices rising in volume as opinions clashed. Some supported Roderick, seeing him as a symbol of fairness and integrity. "He's right," called out a burly blacksmith from the back of the crowd. "If she doesn't pay, why should anyone else?" Others, however, sided with Sir Alden and Lady Ilara, believing that nobility deserved special treatment. "Let her go," muttered a well-dressed merchant. "She serves the king. Her time is better spent elsewhere." As the argument dragged on, tempers flared on both sides. Sir Alden stepped forward, his hand tightening around the hilt of his sword. "Enough of this nonsense," he growled. "You forget your place, Captain. Stand down now, or face the repercussions." Roderick hesitated for a moment, weighing his options. He knew full well what those repercussions might entail: a formal complaint to the king, potential demotion, or even imprisonment. But he also knew that backing down would send a dangerous message, that privilege trumped principle. Taking a deep breath, he straightened his posture and looked Sir Alden directly in the eye. "My place is here, protecting the people of Eldenford and upholding the law," Roderick said firmly. "If you wish to intervene, then do so, but understand that I cannot abandon my duty." The crowd gasped audibly at his boldness. Even Lady Ilara seemed taken aback, though she quickly masked her surprise with another smirk. Sir Alden, meanwhile, bristled visibly. His face reddened, and his fingers twitched near his weapon. For a brief moment, it seemed as though he might draw his sword right there in the middle of the marketplace. But before anything could escalate further, an older man pushed his way through the throng. Dressed in simple clothing, he carried himself with quiet dignity. "Please," he pleaded, addressing both Roderick and Sir Alden. "This isn't helping anyone. Can't we find a way to resolve this peacefully?" His plea went unanswered, drowned out by the growing tension between the two groups. Roderick's men instinctively moved closer to him, forming a loose line against the king's guards. Merchants began packing up their stalls, sensing that the situation was spiraling out of control. Mothers pulled their children away from the edges of the crowd, while others lingered, unable to tear themselves away from the drama unfolding before them. For a moment, it felt as though the entire city teetered on the brink of chaos. Every word exchanged, every step taken, brought them closer to a breaking point. And yet, amidst the hostility, there was a flicker of hope, a silent understanding that cooler heads needed to prevail. But whether reason would win out remained uncertain, leaving everyone in suspense as the standoff continued. The tension in the marketplace was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. Sir Alden's hand hovered dangerously close to his sword, his knuckles white from gripping the hilt. Captain Roderick stood firm, his expression unwavering despite the storm brewing around him. The two groups, Roderick's officers and the king's guards, formed opposing lines, their body language tense and ready for action. It felt as though the entire city had stopped breathing, waiting to see who would blink first. Lady Ilara, ever the center of attention, seemed unfazed by the escalating situation. She adjusted her emerald green gown casually, as if this were nothing more than a minor inconvenience. Her smug smile widened when she noticed the growing unease among the townsfolk. "Really, must we waste any more time on this?" she said aloud, her voice dripping with impatience. "Surely there are better things to do than argue over such trivial matters." Her dismissive tone only fueled the frustration bubbling beneath the surface. One of Roderick's men muttered under his breath, "Trivial. She thinks feeding families and building roads is trivial." Though quiet, the comment carried just enough weight to draw angry glares from Lady Ilara's attendants. Tempers were fraying faster now, and it was clear that patience was running thin on both sides. Sir Alden stepped forward again, his boots clanking against the cobblestones. "You test my patience, Captain," he growled, his voice low but sharp enough to slice through the murmurs of the crowd. "Do not mistake your position for authority. You answer to the crown, just as I do. But today, you cross a line." "And what line is that?" Roderick shot back, his own voice rising slightly. The one where justice bends to suit the whims of the wealthy. If that's the case, then yes, I've crossed it, because I won't stand aside while someone flaunts the law simply because they believe themselves above it. The crowd erupted into whispers, some cheering quietly for Roderick's courage, while others nervously glanced at the king's guards, fearing retaliation. A young boy clutching a wooden toy tugged at his mother's sleeve, asking why everyone looked so angry. She shushed him gently, pulling him closer as the confrontation grew louder. Lady Ilara rolled her eyes dramatically, clearly bored with the exchange. "Oh, spare us the theatrics," she interjected, drawing all eyes back to her. "This isn't about justice. It's about pride. Yours, Captain, and yours, Sir Alden. Neither of you wants to back down because you're too stubborn to admit when you're wrong." Her words struck a nerve. Sir Alden turned sharply toward her, his face reddening even further. "Stay out of this, Lady Ilara," he snapped, his tone sharper than intended. "Your behavior has caused enough trouble already." Ilara raised an eyebrow, clearly unaccustomed to being spoken to in such a manner. For a moment, she looked genuinely surprised, but then her lips curled into a sly grin. "How amusing," she said smoothly. "You defend me one moment and scold me the next. Truly, consistency is not your strong suit, Sir Alden." The dig stung, and Sir Alden's jaw clenched tightly. He took a step back, visibly struggling to compose himself. Meanwhile, Roderick seized the opportunity to address the crowd directly. "People of Eldenford," he began, his voice steady and clear. "This isn't about me or Lady Ilara, or even Sir Alden. This is about fairness, for all of us. If we allow exceptions, no matter how small, we weaken the foundation of our community. Is that what we want?" His words resonated with many in the crowd, earning nods of agreement and murmurs of support. But not everyone was convinced. A merchant near the front scoffed loudly, shaking his head. "Fairness doesn't put food on my table," he grumbled. "If she doesn't pay, I lose out." And yet here we are, arguing instead of resolving anything. As the debate raged on, the atmosphere grew increasingly volatile. Merchants began packing up their goods, sensing that the standoff might turn violent. Mothers ushered their children away, casting worried glances over their shoulders. Even the usually boisterous street performers had gone silent, their instruments resting forgotten at their feet. It was during this chaotic lull that Sir Alden made a grave mistake. Losing his temper entirely, he unsheathed his sword with a metallic ring that echoed through the square. "Enough talk," he bellowed, pointing the blade toward Roderick. "Either you yield, or I will remove you myself." The crowd gasped collectively, recoiling in shock. Roderick's men immediately drew their weapons, forming a protective barrier around their captain. The king's guards followed suit, their movements synchronized and menacing. For a moment, it seemed as though violence was inevitable, and the fragile peace of Eldenford hung precariously in the balance. Just as the tension reached its breaking point, a commanding voice sliced through the chaos like a blade. "Enough." The single word thundered across the square, so powerful that it froze everyone in place. Heads turned in unison to see who had dared interrupt the escalating standoff. Emerging from the edge of the crowd was Sir Callum, one of the most respected members of the King's Guard. Unlike Sir Alden, whose fiery temper often overshadowed his judgment, Sir Callum carried himself with quiet authority. His silver hair gleamed under the sunlight, and though his armor bore the same crimson cape as his comrades, there was something different about him, a sense of wisdom earned through decades of service. He moved with deliberate steps, his presence commanding immediate respect. Sir Callum stopped between the two factions, his piercing gray eyes scanning the scene before settling on Sir Alden. "What madness is this?" he demanded, his tone sharp but controlled. "Have you lost all reason, drawing your sword in the middle of our people? Is this how we uphold the king's honor, by threatening violence against those who serve him?" Sir Alden opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. Instead, he lowered his sword slowly, shame flickering across his face. Lady Ilara, who had been watching with smug satisfaction, suddenly looked uneasy. Even Roderick relaxed his stance slightly, sensing that Sir Callum's arrival might steer them away from disaster. Turning to Roderick, Sir Callum softened his tone but remained firm. "Captain, I understand your duty to enforce the law. But tell me, is this truly worth risking bludgeoned over? Can we not find a solution that preserves both justice and peace?" Roderick hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "I only seek fairness, Sir Callum," he replied. "If Lady Ilara refuses to pay the toll, it sets a dangerous precedent. Others will follow her example, and soon the rules mean nothing." Sir Callum considered this, stroking his beard thoughtfully. Then he turned to Lady Ilara, fixing her with a stern gaze. "And you, my lady," he said, his voice heavy with disappointment. "Do you realize the harm caused by your actions today? You claim loyalty to the crown, yet here you stand, sowing division among the very people the king swore to protect. Is this the behavior expected of someone in your position?" For once, Lady Ilara had no clever retort. She shifted uncomfortably under Sir Callum's scrutiny, her usual confidence wavering. "It's just a toll," she muttered defensively, though her voice lacked its earlier bravado. "Surely the kingdom won't crumble over a few coins." "A few coins," Sir Callum repeated, raising an eyebrow. "No, my lady, it is not about the coins themselves. It is about trust. If the people see their leaders flouting the rules without consequence, they lose faith, not just in us, but in the system itself. And without trust, what hope do we have of unity?" The crowd murmured in agreement, many nodding along with Sir Callum's words. Even some of Lady Ilara's attendants exchanged uneasy glances, realizing the weight of the situation. Sir Alden stood silently, his earlier aggression replaced by quiet reflection. Seeing an opportunity, Sir Callum raised his hands in a gesture of calm. "Let us end this foolishness now," he declared, addressing everyone present. "Lady Ilara, if you value your reputation and your loyalty to the crown, you will pay the toll. Captain Roderick, if you value peace and order, you will accept her compliance and move forward. There is no need for further conflict here." His words hung in the air, carrying a gravity that silenced even the most vocal dissenters. Slowly, reluctantly, Lady Ilara reached into her purse and handed a handful of coins to the nearest merchant. Though her expression betrayed her displeasure, she said nothing more. Roderick gave a slight nod of acknowledgement, signaling that the matter was resolved, for now. As the crowd began to disperse, relief washed over the square like a cool breeze after a storm. Merchants returned to their stalls, children resumed their play, and the hum of daily life gradually filled the air once again. Yet beneath the surface, questions lingered. Would lessons be learned from this day? Or would old tensions resurface, waiting for another spark to ignite them? Only time would tell. Though the immediate crisis seemed to have passed, the air remained charged with unresolved tension. Lady Ilara's compliance, grudging as it was, had temporarily diffused the situation, but wounds still lingered beneath the surface. The crowd began to disperse, yet whispers continued to ripple through the marketplace like a quiet undercurrent. Some praised Roderick for standing his ground, while others muttered about the arrogance of the nobility and the futility of challenging them. Lady Ilara, however, wasn't ready to let the matter rest quietly. As she adjusted her gown and prepared to leave, she shot one final barb at Roderick. "You may think you've won something today," she said, her voice dripping with disdain, "but don't mistake this for victory. You're nothing more than a peasant in fancy armor, playing at being important." Her words struck a nerve, not just with Roderick, but with many of the townsfolk who overheard her insult. A collective gasp rippled through the remaining onlookers, followed by murmurs of outrage. For some, it was the final straw. One elderly woman stepped forward, pointing a gnarled finger at Lady Ilara. "Peasant or not, he works harder for this city than you ever will," she exclaimed, her voice trembling with emotion. At least he doesn't strut around acting like the rules don't apply to him. The comment ignited a wave of support for Roderick. Voices rose from different corners of the square, calling out their agreement. "She's right," shouted a baker, wiping flour from his hands. "Captain Roderick risks his life every day for us. What do you do, my lady? Throw parties and demand special treatment?" Lady Ilara's face flushed with anger, her composure cracking under the weight of public criticism. She opened her mouth to retaliate, but before she could speak, Sir Alden intervened, placing a firm hand on her arm. "Enough," he said sharply, though his tone carried a note of warning rather than support. It was clear even he recognized that pushing further would only worsen the situation. Roderick, meanwhile, stood frozen, caught between pride and humility. He hadn't expected such an outpouring of support, nor had he anticipated how deeply Lady Ilara's words would sting. Though he'd spent years serving the people of Eldenford, moments like this reminded him of the invisible divide between classes, a divide he couldn't fully bridge, no matter how hard he tried. But then, something unexpected happened. From the back of the crowd, a young boy no older than 10 pushed his way forward, clutching a wooden toy soldier in one hand. His wide eyes were fixed on Roderick as he held out the other hand, offering a small copper coin. "Here, Captain," the boy said earnestly. "You can have this. I know it's not much, but you deserve it." The simple gesture silenced the square once again. Roderick knelt down to meet the boy's gaze, touched by the sincerity in his voice. "Thank you," he said softly, accepting the coin with care. "But keep it. Use it to buy yourself something nice. This city needs brave hearts like yours more than anything." Tears welled up in the boy's eyes as he nodded, clutching his toy tightly. Around them, the crowd erupted into cheers, clapping and whistling in admiration. For a brief moment, the divisions that had plagued the city seemed to fade, replaced by a shared sense of unity and gratitude. Yet amidst the celebration, Sir Alden watched silently, his expression unreadable. He glanced at Lady Ilara, whose forced smile barely concealed her fury, and then at Roderick, who now stood surrounded by supporters. Something shifted in his demeanor, a flicker of doubt, perhaps, or maybe even respect. Whatever it was, it went unnoticed by most, drowned out by the jubilation of the moment. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the cobblestones, the marketplace slowly returned to its usual rhythm. Merchants reopened their stalls, children laughed and played, and the hum of daily life resumed. But beneath the surface, cracks remained. Lady Ilara's insult had exposed raw emotions that couldn't be easily mended. And while peace had been restored, for now, the fragile balance between power and fairness still teetered precariously, waiting for the next spark to ignite it once again. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, the marketplace began to settle into an uneasy calm. The cheers for Captain Roderick had faded, leaving behind a quiet tension that lingered like the last embers of a dying fire. Lady Ilara, her pride wounded and her face flushed with embarrassment, turned sharply on her heel and strode toward her carriage, her attendants scrambling to keep up. She didn't look back, not at the crowd, not at Sir Alden, and certainly not at Roderick. Her departure was swift, but telling. It was clear she wanted nothing more than to escape the scene of her humiliation. Sir Alden watched her go, his jaw clenched tightly. He knew this incident would not be forgotten easily, neither by Lady Ilara, nor by those who now viewed her as a symbol of unchecked privilege. For a moment, he stood frozen, torn between loyalty to his duty and the growing realization that perhaps justice wasn't as black and white as he'd always believed. When he finally turned to address Roderick, his tone was softer, almost hesitant. "This shouldn't have happened," he admitted gruffly, avoiding eye contact. "I let my temper get the better of me." Roderick nodded slowly, recognizing the rare apology for what it was. "We all make mistakes," he replied evenly. "What matters is how we move forward from them." His words carried weight, not just for Sir Alden, but for everyone present. It was a reminder that even those in positions of power were fallible, and that humility could pave the way for healing. Sir Callum stepped forward once again, his presence still commanding respect despite the day's weariness etched into his features. "Enough blood has been spilled over pride and prejudice," he said, addressing both the remaining guards and the townsfolk who lingered nearby. "Today showed us the cracks in our foundation. If we wish to preserve this city and the trust of its people, we must work together to mend them." His words resonated deeply, earning murmurs of agreement from the crowd. Yet even as hope flickered to life, there were lingering doubts. A merchant raised his hand hesitantly, drawing Sir Callum's attention. "But what happens tomorrow?" the man asked, his voice tinged with uncertainty. "Will Lady Ilara simply forget this? Will others follow her example? How can we ensure fairness when some believe they're above the law?" The question hung heavy in the air, unanswered for a long moment. Then Sir Callum sighed, running a hand through his silver hair. "Change doesn't happen overnight," he said honestly, "but it begins with accountability. From this day forward, I vow to speak to the king about these issues. No one, not even the nobility, should be exempt from the laws that bind us all." His promise drew nods of approval, though skepticism lingered in some eyes. Roderick stepped forward, adding his own voice to the conversation. "And I pledge to continue enforcing the law fairly, without fear or favor," he declared, his steady gaze meeting the crowd's. "But I cannot do it alone. I need your help, your courage, to hold each other accountable. Only then can we build a future where justice truly serves everyone." The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers echoing through the square. Children waved enthusiastically at Roderick, while adults clapped him on the shoulder, offering words of gratitude. Even Sir Alden managed a reluctant smile, extending a hand toward the captain. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "you have my respect." Roderick accepted the handshake, feeling a sense of cautious optimism, but as the celebration continued around him, his thoughts drifted to the challenges ahead. Lady Ilara's insult might have galvanized the townsfolk today, but old habits died hard. Would the nobility push back against reform? Could the fragile unity forged in this moment withstand the pressures of time? As night fell and lanterns were lit throughout the marketplace, casting warm glows onto weary faces, the people of Eldenford allowed themselves a brief reprieve. They laughed, shared stories, and reveled in the small victory they'd achieved together. Yet beneath the surface, questions remained unanswered, and scars unhealed. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but for the first time in a long while, there was hope that change was possible. And sometimes, hope was enough to light the way forward. The following days in Eldenford were unlike any that had come before. Word of the confrontation in the marketplace spread quickly, carried by merchants, travelers, and even children playing in the streets. The story grew with each retelling. Some exaggerated Roderick's bravery, others highlighted Lady Ilara's haughty defiance. But at its core, it remained a tale of justice versus privilege. For the townsfolk, it became more than just an incident. It was a symbol of hope that fairness might one day triumph over arrogance. Lady Ilara, however, did not take the events lightly. She retreated to her estate on the outskirts of the city, avoiding public appearances for weeks. Rumors swirled about her anger, with some claiming she demanded retribution from the king himself. But when no official complaint came forward, people began to suspect that even she understood the weight of public opinion. Her absence from the city left a void, but it also gave the townsfolk time to reflect on what had happened, and what could change if they stood united. Sir Alden surprised many by seeking out Captain Roderick a few days later. The two met near the edge of the marketplace, where the cobblestones still bore faint scuff marks from the earlier standoff. "I owe you an apology," Sir Alden admitted, his voice quieter than usual. "I let my pride cloud my judgment. You were right. We all serve the same kingdom, and none of us is above the law." Roderick accepted the apology graciously, recognizing the effort it must have taken for a proud knight like Sir Alden to admit fault. "We're on the same side," he replied simply. "Let's focus on making sure this never happens again." Their newfound understanding marked the beginning of a fragile alliance between the armed officers and the king's guard, an alliance built not on power, but on shared purpose. Meanwhile, Sir Callum kept his promise. He traveled to the royal court to speak directly with the king, presenting a detailed account of the day's events and urging reforms to ensure fairness across all ranks. To everyone's surprise, the king listened intently. Though known for favoring tradition, he acknowledged the growing unrest among his people and agreed to implement measures aimed at greater accountability, even for the nobility. It wasn't a sweeping revolution, but it was a start. Back in Eldenford, life slowly returned to normal, or as close to normal as it could be after such a dramatic event. Merchants reopened their stalls with renewed enthusiasm, knowing their tolls contributed to projects benefiting the entire city. Children played games inspired by the day's heroics, pretending to be brave captains or wise knights. And though tensions still simmered beneath the surface, there was a newfound sense of possibility in the air. For Roderick, the experience changed him in subtle ways. He continued his patrols with the same dedication as always, but now he noticed something different: respect. People greeted him warmly, thanked him openly, and occasionally slipped small tokens of gratitude into his hands. A loaf of bread here, a bouquet of flowers there. These gestures reminded him why he had chosen this path in the first place, not for glory, but to make a difference. Yet, as peaceful as things seemed, Roderick knew better than to grow complacent. One victory didn't erase centuries of inequality, and old habits died hard. Still, he found solace in the knowledge that progress, no matter how slow, was possible when people worked together. As he stood atop the city walls one evening, watching the sun set over Eldenford, he felt a quiet pride, not in himself, but in the resilience of the community he served. In the end, the day of the confrontation became a turning point for Eldenford. It wasn't perfect, and challenges undoubtedly lay ahead. But for the first time in years, the people dared to dream of a future where fairness wasn't just an ideal, it was a reality worth fighting for. And sometimes, that dream was enough to keep them moving forward, one step at a time.